Good evening. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater, home of the UCLA Film and Television Archives public programs. I'm May HaDuong, the Archives Director, and it is my honor to welcome you tonight to an evening celebrating the life and legacy of Robert Bob Rosen. I met Bob 20 years ago as a graduate student here at UCLA. Unbeknownst to me, the very film archiving program that I was in was created under Bob's leadership, then Dean of the School of Theater, Film, and Television. I would run into Bob at film festivals, including Outfest, and Bob, who surely had more important people to talk with and to speak with, would take the time to speak with me, a budding archivist, about film and the importance of preservation. Bob was a film historian whose life work involved the literal act of seeing. He had a way of setting his eyes on you and making you stand attention, and it is this incredible presence and passion that shaped the Film and Television Archive to what it is today. The archive story began 60 years ago when faculty in the then College of Fine Arts began collecting moving image materials for teaching. A scrappy study center collection took life, and incredible individuals began advocating for more than a place of study and research, but a home to film and television in what would become the largest moving image archive at a university. Bob mentions 200,000 items. We are at 500,000 items and growing. Some of these amazing individuals who were part of that story, Howard Suber, Bob Epstein, Ruth Schwartz, many others, made a big impact, and of course, there was Bob. In 1975, he joined the archive as its founding director, then named as the School of Theater, Film, and Television. He advocated for the research and study of moving images in a time when foregrounding cinema and media studies was, as Bob said, considered the intellectual equivalent of teaching a class on Scrabble. And yet, he was tireless. Raised in a community of political and cultural radicals, Bob's entrepreneurial spirit served to advance not one but two fields, cinema and media studies as the Dean of Theater, Film, and Television, and the field of moving image archiving. Bob saw a challenge and an opportunity, charting a course that brings us all here today. I've met a couple people who were hired directly from Bob. I wanted to see if you wanted to raise your hand. Obviously, Chan, you mentioned yourself. There's Jim Williamson. There's a couple people, Jeff, Chris Horak, former director of the archive, many others. So that impact is lasting. I saw some students or recent graduates from the program of Media Archival Studies here. Thank you for coming to learn about Bob with us tonight. He held numerous leadership positions, including as founding director of the National Center for Film and Video Preservation at the American Film Institute, and he was a film critic and was on KCRW for 10 years, amongst his many accomplishments. He played a key role in the formation of the Film Foundation and was founding chair of the Film Foundation's Archivists Advisory Council. Among his roles was as a member of the National Film Preservation Board of the Library of Congress. Bob was a champion for independent cinema, and I would run into him, as I mentioned, at Outfest, but we also served on the Legacy Project Advisory Committee. He was here as a faculty advisor to the formation of Outfest over 40 years ago, and also really helped start not just the training of film archivists here at UCLA, but creating the largest collection of queer moving images in the world in the Legacy Project collection. He was instrumental in forming deep partnerships with studios, filmmakers, and collectors who would set the stage for transforming this small study center collection into a world-class collection of 500,000 items. One such partnership is that of the Packard Humanities Institute, a nonprofit foundation established by David Woodley Packard and dedicated to archaeology, music, film preservation, and historical archives. To share more about his impact and In that capacity, I'm honored to read some remarks that the Packard Humanities Institute STOA director, Pat Lockney, who's unfortunately could not join us tonight, that he shared. In 1989, the U.S. Congress passed the National Film Preservation Act, which established the Library of Congress, National Film Preservation Board, and the National Film Registry. That act became law when it was signed by President Ronald Reagan. The purpose of the National Film Preservation Act was to create public awareness about the tremendous loss of America's movie heritage since the film industry was founded in 1894. The unique thing about that legislation was that for the first time in U.S. history, it directed the Library of Congress to convene a yearly meeting of one group consisting of representatives of the U.S. film studios, film critics, Directors Guild of America, and Screen Actors Guild, and the National Association of Theater Owners, as well as film archivists. To serve as acting chair of the first meeting held in Washington, D.C., the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, selected Bob Rosen to convene the meeting and make a statement about why America's film heritage was so vitally important. Bob spoke eloquently. That meeting marked a major turning point in establishing the public cause of film preservation as a truly nationwide activity and as a cultural preservation effort equal to the importance of saving historical buildings, national parks, public art, and other things of importance to the American people. Bob set the the National Film Preservation Foundation, and made a mark with the Film Foundation on a solid foundation, which it continues to hold to this day. Bob's impact included championing film programming as an important core activity of an archive. We preserve and we show. And so as Dean of TFT, he oversaw an important milestone when the Billy Wilder Theater was built in collaboration with the Hammer Museum, thanks to the efforts of then Chairman of the Archives Board, Curtis Hanson. I want to draw your attention to two empty seats with gray hoods in the theater on your right or left. The archive, one of those two directions. The archive, in advance of tonight's program, had those two seats named in honor, one for Curtis Hanson, whose 80th birthday would be on Monday, and the man of our hour, Robert Rosen. D101 is Curtis's seat, and E101 is Bob's. They are now with us, of course, always. The archive, now part of the UCLA Library, has partnered with the School of Theater, Film, and Television in tonight's program. As Dean of TFT from 1999 to 2009, Bob's passion and leadership for global access and world-class education continues to inspire at both the archive and the school. When he passed away last year, I began working closely and had the privilege to work with chosen family and colleagues. I want to thank Leslie Dyer, Christopher Bradley, David Egen, and Eddie Richmond for shaping tonight's program. Deep gratitude goes to Interim Dean Chan Noriega and the School of Theater, Film, and Television for partnering, as well as the Norman and Arena Powell University librarian, Athena N. Jackson, for her support and leadership. Thank you, Chan and Athena. Much of the archive's operations, including programming and preservation, are funded through donations. I'm deeply grateful to our supporters, including the anonymous donor who makes our free programming possible. Finally, thanks to our community partner and the UCLA Alumni Association and the archive staff who helped make this evening happen. Let's give all of these individuals and partners a round of applause. Tonight, you'll hear from a handful of Bob's chosen family and friends. Please allow me to share a little bit about each of them. Bob's friend Peter Guber sent us a video message from abroad. A regent for the University of California and chairman and CEO of Mandalay Entertainment Group, Peter was the chairman and CEO of Sony Pictures Entertainment and produced Academy Award-nominated and winning films. Margaret Bodde is the executive director of the Film Foundation, the nonprofit organization created by Martin Scorsese in 1990 to protect and preserve motion picture history. Margaret is also the award-winning producer and several of Scorsese's documentaries and will introduce his video message tonight. Deborah Nadoolman Landis is a distinguished professor and faculty director of the David C. Copley Center for the Study of Costume Design. Her distinguished career includes Animal House, The Blues Brothers, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Trading Places, Coming to America, and the groundbreaking music video of Michael Jackson's Thriller. Geoffrey Gilmore was a longtime student and later colleague of Bob's, serving for 15 years as the head of UCLA Film and Television Archives Programming Department before joining the Sundance Institute in 1990. Gilmore served as the director of the Sundance Film Festival and for 2 decades served there, and then later as the CCO of Tribeca Enterprises. He remains active in the world of independent film. We'll be joined later by Alexander Payne, who will introduce tonight's film, Kiss Me Deadly. And finally, from Bob's chosen family, we're joined by David Egen, who met Bob as a freshman at UCLA. Bob was his mentor, friend, and later collaborator on projects both documentary and academic. David works professionally as an editor and filmmaker. Please join me in welcoming David Egen.
I'm not sure Bob would have been prickly about someone summarizing his life because, imagine, he was an exceptional educator, a brilliant conversationalist, but most of all, a dear friend. I think these kinds of things, there's one thing that really distinguished him. It wasn't one, but if there was one that stood out, it was that Bob saw reductionist thinking as intellectual kryptonite. If you came out of a film and your opinion was that you liked it or didn't like it, he'd bristle. And before you knew it, he was challenging you. What didn't work about the movie you didn't like? What did work about the movie you didn't like, and why? What were the style and story elements that made a difference? Bob challenged the motive behind boiling things down to a thumbs up or thumbs down or a number. He believed in allowing things to be complex and including their paradoxes. So I kind of like the one brilliant conversationalist because there was this one time he was at a movie screening and was greeted by a couple of women. And he said to me later, he said, "I think they were socialites." And one of them introduced Bob to the other as a brilliant conversationalist. And he later told me, "I don't even know exactly what that means, but I knew immediately I didn't want to be one." Every day for Bob was an opportunity to elevate the humdrum events of daily life into something extraordinary and revelatory and story-worthy, or at least hilarious. I lived with Bob off and on over the years after college, and every day he'd raise the banal to the sublime. I remember waking up one morning after he'd come back from one of his trips to Europe, and we met in the kitchen as he stormed out of the bathroom, grabbed up a bowl of cereal and a handful of nuts and raisins, and gorged. Out with the old world, in with the new. I once asked Bob after one of these daylight saving time changes what he was going to do with his fallback extra hour. "Oh, I save it and take it out when I really need it." I saw both sides of Bob, the public Bob who inspired people with poignant, witty, and prickly observations, challenging questions, engaging stories, who'd performed feats of spontaneous oratory versus the private Bob, who took every opportunity to be inspiring, make poignant observations, pose challenging questions, and burst into spontaneous oratory. One Bob was both the same. He was always on, always performing, and always, thinking great thoughts, usually while driving. I first met Bob my freshman year at UCLA for lunch, and the first thing you notice were the crumbs. Anyone who knew him, he ate in the grand old style of Cookie Monster. But within minutes, you were past that, and he elevated lunch into a symphony of ideas, observations, and questions. One meal, and you were hooked. You wanted to meet him again and learn more. And he delivered. Every encounter, every lecture, you couldn't wait for your next hit of inspiration and revelation. It was like a drug. And you wondered, how does he even do that? It wasn't a secret. A big part had to do with in particular, about dialectical thinking. Anyone who got too close to Bob got hit with that word repeatedly. What is that? I was a student. He said, "You don't know about dialectics." I'll tell you, once you start thinking that way, you'll never go back. Which sounded somewhat ominous. This is someone who'd grown up in an anarchist colony in New Jersey among socialists, communists, and nudists. So you can imagine the specter of indoctrination. But he had a pretty seductive take on it. It's all about looking at things from multiple perspectives. You look for the paradoxes, and wherever you find a contradiction, there's probably something interesting going on there. Conflict, contradiction, discomfort, dissonance, don't avoid them, embrace them. These are the things that make meaning, that drive history and drive change. And it just so happens, he said, that it also drives stories. When Bob recognized my rather insatiable appetite for his stories and sensibilities, and I had no money for a car, he took me everywhere. Movie screenings, gala events, political fundraisers, political protests, dive bars, gay bars, transvestite bars. Hyperion is where the working class gays hang out. Not that good looking, but not so pretentious. One time we were at a party, and there were all these men standing around in suits and ties, and young French women everywhere, very friendly. No one was clearly selling anything, polite but sort of boring. A lot of cigars and forced sort of old crone laughs. And in the car on the way home, none of it made any sense to me. Some of the girls would come up to me and talk briefly. There was a weird sense of just a brief sort of sense of longing you'd see. And I didn't feel it was directed at me in particular. And they'd come and then they'd leave again. And on the way home, I said, "Bob, what was that event? I didn't even make any sense to me." He says, That was a bunch of successful American businessmen and their French trophy wives." And we laughed the whole rest of the way home. He took me to France, to the Deauville Film Festival. Everywhere was stories. Big ones like the French Revolution, oddball stories, bits of architecture, out-of-the-way places. At one point, "That's Sam Fuller, a director. You should go say hi to him, but get some real shoes." And he bought me some shoes. To watch a movie sitting next to Bob was itself an experience. As smart and intellectual as he was about movies, he was sensitive to the idea of over-intellectualizing the movie experience. "You don't watch a movie and analyze on the first viewing," he said. "That would be overly analytical. You watch a movie like everyone else. Give yourself over to the suspension of disbelief and experience it fully." He actually didn't watch movies like everyone else. As a movie was starting, he would go through, from what I could tell, a series of subliminal rituals, sort of humming and folding his arms and tapping his feet, straight right in the seat next to you. And he seemed to be transforming into something else. And he was, subconsciously, as best as I could tell, becoming this intensely concentrated, focused, immensely engaged audience. I remember watching him in a class screening of The Best Years of Our Lives. No one in our class took it seriously. The writing and acting style felt dated and maybe stilted, and everyone was laughing at it. And I laughed right along with the rest of the class until I looked over at Bob, who was sitting there quietly crying at the very same scene in the film. And it immediately transformed the meaning of that movie for me in that moment. That class was an object lesson in seeing things from multiple perspectives. On the first viewing of a movie, Bob would say, you appreciate it on its terms after that first screening, or maybe a second, then you start to reflect on it. For that, he developed a whole world of tools and discipline for systematically interrogating how movies worked. And the goal was not to be academic. It was not about being smart per se. He was very clear that the goal was to put these ideas into action, to make them useful for filmmakers. That was his actual and stated goal. I ate that up as a student. I was obsessed with it. At the time, those ideas seemed so erudite and so transformative and so filled with potential. And all these years later, it is different. I live with these ideas, but that when they were once academic, they're now an everyday tool. I live with this stuff every day. You learn a lot working with a lot of different people in Hollywood at different projects over the years, but these tools, Bob's tools, these are the power tools. These are the ones I use absolutely every day, and they're the most reliably useful in so many different contexts, from problem solving, structure building, as a writing tool, a ghostwriting tool. It's an improv tool I use, and I even use it for technical ends. I won't get into the details, but I remember sitting in his office one day, and he was reading down the list of entries of what he called the style matrix. And we got to antinomies, anomalies, and clusters. And he just waited, and I must have looked disturbed, and he paused and stared until he got that look of terror from me, and then he laughed. He said, and I won't explain it here, but those three alone I use literally every day. They're powerful tools in creation. Intellectualism, not for its own sake. Theory has to be useful. If it doesn't work in practice, it's not theory. It's pseudo-intellectualism until you change the theory so that it works in the real world. Bob was militantly anti-pseudo-intellectual, and simultaneously he chafed at militant anti-intellectualism at the same time. That said, pseudo-intellectualism does have its place. There was this one time we went to a party of this very wealthy woman who had turned her house into an art gallery to showcase her work. On every wall, in every room of her large and luxurious house were images of certain mathematical symbols. And sometimes it was painted in oil, sometimes in watercolor, one was in acrylic, one in tapestry. None of this was making it wasn't working for me. And I finally found Bob in a distant room of the house staring up at the biggest version of this symbol. And I said, "So," I said in his voice, I said, "What do you think?" Both of us talked like Bob at the same time to each other. And he said, looking at the symbol, "There seems to be a theme here, but I can't quite put my finger on it." So we started to laugh, but it turned out someone had heard him say that, and believing this was the beginning of an important insight, a crowd gathered around Bob. The artist herself showed up, and Bob gave me this deer in the headlights look and just started talking. "You take the notion of the form as you loop around to the end, but now you do a simple twist 180 degrees, and suddenly it becomes a Mobius strip such that when you arrive from the end to where you began, you're on the other side." Problem solved. So this is getting long, and I realize I didn't have time to write, so I'll skip over. I don't want to bore you guys to that. But if I started this by talking about how Bob was uncomfortable with having his identity boiled down, and there was a lot of pieces to his identity. But if I were to come up with a way of characterizing who he was, it actually happened for me probably about 20 years ago. It was, I remember he was introducing a woman who I hope some of you would know, Marina Goldovskaya, who was a director from the Soviet Union. Her father had been a friend of Sergei Eisenstein, and they started the film school in Moscow. And Bob had helped her escape after, I guess, Boris Yeltsin fell and Putin started to rise, and she came here warning about the dangers of Putin back a long time ago. And Bob did his usual inspired, charismatic introduction of her. Fantastic, oratory, no doubt improvised. And then she got up and started talking. And I was sitting in the audience away from Bob, watching him watch her. And he suddenly got sat down in the audience and got really quiet and just listened as she talked about her life. And I saw him starting to cry. And it occurred to me at that moment, he was mesmerized by her. And I said to myself, watching him watch her, that's who he is. He sees her as a phenomenon. And he is a voracious devourer of contradictions, of contrasts. He's someone who would loudly perform right in front of you and then shut up and just listen and eat it up. And it's just, how to explain it? It was just, that's who he was. That's who I saw him as. And I think he'd be very proud to be remembered that way. Thank you.
I had the pleasure of being coached, mentored by Bob Rosen. Robert Rosen was more than just a dean or a teacher. He was a pal. He was an inspiration, not just a perspiration. He drove the bus and sat in the back of the bus. He was always a participant in my journey, and I loved the fact that I was a participant in his. He was always willing to pitch and catch. He taught me so much in the journey of how to be a really good teacher at UCLA and how to lead students and inspire students. Thank you for so much that you give to the school, that you gave to myself, and to all the students. I am a better person for having you in my life.
David, that was incredible. Thank you for bringing Bob back. Really, really amazing. I first started working for Martin Scorsese in 1991, which was a year after he created the Film Foundation. Because I had studied cinema and because I had some experience and interest in preservation, he thought I could be helpful with this new fledgling organization. I soon met Bob Rosen, who became my mentor, my friend, and a guiding light through the years, which then turned into decades. Like so many others in this room, like Jennifer Ahn, who's my partner in the Film Foundation, I learned so much from Bob. He was extraordinarily generous with his knowledge, which was comprehensive and extensive and infinite, seemingly. He had a clarity in his thinking and communicating about film and preservation that I had really never encountered before, outside of Marty, of course. And he was just, in those early years, he was really just essential to the foundation. And at every opportunity, we would try to just communicate and raise awareness for the urgent need for film preservation. And whenever Marty had a new film coming out and was going to be speaking to the press, or he's going to be on television, or any kind of opportunity, he would be like, call Bob. We have to know what's going on. We have to know what the archives need. He needs to help us with the message. And as busy as Bob was, he just would give you all the time. And he always had a very clear message, and it was very specific about just what is needed at that moment. And he just, like I said, he really helped shape, all of our work and was just there with us. Bob's ideas were often organized in numbers, 3 objectives, 5 points, 4 core ideas. And in looking back through my notes, I found an email from him from 2010 where he laid out 11 reasons why the film community should still care about film. And he listed those reasons from number 1, Hollywood and the digital tsunami, to number 11, artist rights and preservation in the digital age. And that list of 11 imperatives is still completely relevant today. As I got to know Bob, he would regale me with stories about his childhood growing up in the Francisco Ferrer colony, where he described it as learning the values of tolerance, the importance of ideas, the virtues of risk-taking for the collective good. And he carried those lessons throughout his life, from his amazing time, as he would describe his time in Paris as a young political radical, to his work as an advocate for film education and preservation. Bob was an idealist. He was a firebrand and just a truly remarkable human being that just touched me to my core. Marty Scorsese loved Bob and just, revered him and admired him the way we all do. And he wanted to share a personal message with you that he taped in from New York.
It's an honor to pay tribute to Bob Rosen as my friend, my fellow advocate, my compadre. I wish I could be there with you to celebrate Bob's extraordinary impact on film preservation, which of course is immeasurable. When I think about the progress we've made, I know we owe a great deal to his leadership, which was visionary. When we first met in the late 80s, I was struck immediately by the energy, incredible enthusiasm, clear-eyed, fearless. And I was working with UCLA trying to get permissions from the studios to preserve films title by title as best I could. At that time, preservation departments at the studios really didn't exist, and the films in their collections, I know, were in danger. But Bob recognized that something had to change on a really grand scale. It needed an organized effort to make everyone understand that preservation was a necessity and that the studios needed to work in collaboration with the archives. In 1990, I had finished Goodfellas. It was released, and people went to see it, and it gave me a certain gravity again at the studios. And Bob took this opportunity to organize. He said, why don't you get your fellow filmmakers together, and use this leverage now that you have to advocate at the studios and to raise the consciousness, not only, the public, but also of the studios. So he was essential to making the Film Foundation a reality. Bob even came, I think, to the first meeting that I was allowed to have with the studio head. That was Sony Columbia Pictures, Mickey Schulhoff in New York. We did that meeting together. All of our meetings at the Film Foundation, Bob was always there, helping us to hone our message and keeping the issues of film preservation and protection front and center. In the late 90s, when we had the idea to develop a film education program, he jumped right in, organizing conferences and working with Janine Basinger to shape the curriculum for what would become the story of movies. While later, when I learned about Bob's early days as a student radical, it made perfect sense. We had a cause, and we needed somebody who could agitate, someone who was going to fight alongside us to make major changes in this system. He was strategic, because he always had an eye towards the future, and he could figure out how, the technology was evolving, and he could see the changes that would do in the industry and how it's going to impact film preservation and ultimately the access to the films that are preserved. So he helped the Film Foundation to deal with these changing notions of the motion picture industry field while always keeping in mind the core mission. Bob's legacy is immense. And I'll be forever grateful for his friendship and his dedication to cinema by preserving it, protecting it, and educating generations of filmmakers to care about the work of past masters of the craft.
I'm Deborah Nadoolman Landis. And I'm suddenly feeling a really big loss. Right? I'm feeling that huge feeling of loss. I too want to thank David Egen for bringing Bob back to life, and for Christopher Bradley also. My experience with Bob looks kind of like this, but I'd like to go back a little bit before I met Bob in 1975 for those few people in the audience who didn't know him. And instead of paraphrasing or synopsizing, I'm going to read through Bob's own words from a transcript of an oral history recorded by Christian Dimitriou at the 68th FIFF conference in Beijing in 2012. So these are Bob's own words and a real study in chutzpah. In 1971, Stuart Samuels, a colleague at Penn, proposed that we co-teach a course on the history of the movies, the first of its kind at any history department in the country. This seemed like an absolutely crazy idea, in part because I had no formal training in the area, and in part because teaching movies at a prestigious Ivy League school would be derided by the faculty as the intellectual equivalent of a course on Scrabble. Certainly not something that serious academics would even consider doing if they wanted to keep their job. Well, that was precisely the attraction for two young troublemakers. We did the course, and it did big. 500 students, 25 assistants, and a double bill 5 days a week with live musical accompaniment for the silence. To learn the field ourselves, can you imagine? We engaged in nonstop viewing, reading, and thinking about the movies, resulting in lectures that broke new ground in the field and helped to legitimize academic media studies across the country. He continues. Even more important, many of our students went on to become major innovators and leaders in the entertainment industry. You can see that today. By now, I had become a fervent convert to the cause of teaching and studying the movies, but no idea where or how I could pursue it on a full-time basis. After a year of movie viewing in France in 1974 and a contemplative trek into the Sahara, I was surprised, this is Bob, and delighted to be invited to teach a single 10-week course at the UCLA Department of Film and Television. I never left. Understanding motion pictures and teaching filmmakers was to become my life's goal. And over the course of the next 4 decades, I served as professor, then department chair, and finally for 11 years as dean of the school. In UCLA speak, we call that service. Well, friends, I am one of Bob's filmmakers, and I apologize if what follows sounds like the story of my life. It's only partially the story of my life. However, it is a circular tale that becomes complete through recounting it today. In 1974, I met Bob Rosen in his History of Movies class at TFT. It was my final year as a graduate student in costume design. I don't know if any other costume designers took film courses. That didn't bother me. I loved Bob's passion and connected with it while we watched countless movies in class. He was my favorite teacher. For my final project, I asked Bob if I could write an essay about costume designer Travis Banton's clothing for Marlene Dietrich in Blonde Venus. He was absolutely delighted. Of course he was. You learned about Bob. Of course he was delighted. Everyone remembers that film and the striking contrast between Dietrich's dowdy, careworn clothing as a struggling homemaker and her life as a glamorous nightclub entertainer. This dichotomy defines the art of costume design. Bob, even at 23 years old, I was 23 years old, embraced me as a fellow traveler, crazy about movies, loving history, exploring the frame and its makers. I graduated in 1975, and I began working in the industry collaborating with my husband, John Landis, and other great directors. It was not accidental that when John screened his first movie for me, his other guest was Alan Dwan. We were passionate about movies, returning to the bridges to see silent films with organ accompaniment by Chauncey Haynes. We went to LACMA's Bing Theater and programming courtesy of Ronald Haver and then Ian Burney. We were early supporters of the UCLA Film Archive, which still holds negatives and release prints of John's movies. Most importantly, and this is really key, we were not unique among our contemporaries. We knew upon whose shoulders we stood, and we idolized them. In 1997, Bob and I had lunch together. After 25 years as a practitioner, I contemplating pursuing a doctorate in costume design history, a marginalized field, and still is. I sought his advice. I needed a reliable point of reference. We talked for a long time. And you heard it from David, you heard it from Christopher, you'll hear it from everybody. He was enthusiastic because he always was. And he was generous because he always was. And we scheduled another lunch. This time, he brought along Peter Wolin, whose interests beyond cinema included fashion, feminism, popular culture, and much, much more. I was captivated by the two of them, and they ate me alive. Their encouragement was so overwhelming that I left feeling I could never meet their expectations. It was a ridiculous idea I could barely write. But Bob was so convinced that I could accomplish anything. And 5 years later, adopted by another irrepressible cineast, Christopher Frayling, I received my diploma, my PhD, from the Royal College of Art. And I kept Bob close. In 2002, Bill Craper, then president of the Art Directors Guild, and I, then president of the Costume Designers Guild, approached Bob, who is now dean, about establishing a film design weekend at TFT. You know what Bob said. What a great idea. Yes, of course, let's do it. We plan to host joint daytime panels and premiere a modern film on the first evening and a period film on the following night. Unfortunately, we failed to find the funding, even after we met with Ridley Scott, by the way, and none of that happened. But that weekend, that design weekend, which is still a good idea, evolved into Design Showcase West, TFT's annual national portfolio review for scenic costume lighting and sound designers. And from that idea, it is still co-hosted by the Art Directors Guild and Costume Designers Guild. And if any of you want to come, it's on May 31st this year. In 2006, I met David C. Copley, one of the largest private collectors of Hollywood costume sketches. I drove down to his house in La Jolla, and after 3 hours of whiplash, looking from one classic iconic costume to another, ranging from Garbo to Crawford to Monroe, both Hepburns, across films of every genre and decade, Copley's shared additional albums of artwork from his condo in Chicago, his house in Palm Springs, and on the yacht. David was a dear, quiet, and reticent man. After 3 hours, he finally remarked, "You know a lot about this, don't you?" On my long drive back up the coast, my first call was to Bob at TFT. I said, "If you have any interest in a costume design professorship, I think I found my donor." 2009 was Bob's final year as dean at TFT, and it was my first as the David C. Copley Endowed Chair and director of the David C. Copley Center for Costume Design. Speaking about his first year as director of the UCLA Film Archive, Bob remembered that in 1975, these are his words, despite a dearth of funding, a lack of organized activities, miserable storage facilities, and a largely volunteer staff, I was committed that one day UCLA would become home to a world-class archive. Surely this unrealistic, even insane optimism reflected a youth spent living with radicals. 50 years later, I, and so many of you, are the beneficiary of Bob's love. He was generous, he was kind, he was passionate, he was an inspired teacher, as well as a prototypical Jewish atheist like me. Where would I be without Bob, that insanely optimistic radical? And Christopher, when you talked about luck, how lucky we were. Thank you.
I met Robert, as we always called him, 54 years ago. I think I'm the record holder here. I was sleeping on a couch in the student lounge at the University of Pennsylvania at the beginning of the term. And a guy I didn't know came over to me and we chatted. I didn't have a place to sleep, so he brought me to his house on Alfred's Alley in colonial Philadelphia, the oldest consecutive lived-on street in the United States. And he introduced me to his roommates, one of whom was Robert, a professor in the history department. Over the next couple of days, I sat and talked with this professor, not much older than his students. And thus began the most important, interesting, and special relationship of my life. Robert had this extraordinary effect on people, both professionally and interpersonally. You've heard a lot of it today. He had an extraordinary effect on his students and often on his peers and colleagues. And Robert had an extraordinary effect on me. It's difficult to summarize anyone's life and accomplishments in a short talk. And it's particularly true when life was as remarkable and far-ranging as Robert Rosen was. He was, over the decades, an extremely popular and uniquely gifted thinker and lecturer, and especially because he was an outstanding speaker. He was animated and passionate and wonderfully provocative, hands everywhere. He lectured all over the United States and internationally in China and Australia and France and Italy. And I'd got him invitations everywhere, which he took. He traveled incessantly. And he was brilliant. I remember, just for example, one of my seminars from him at Penn, where he'd been expounding on the 6 different uses of meaning of the concept ideology. After having this seminar with him, I couldn't stop interjecting this concept into every conversation I had for the next week or so, including driving people nuts. And indeed, from that point on, I understood some things. That Bob just didn't teach you what to think. Bob taught you how to think. It was a conceptual change. In his career as an academic, he was a university professor in 3 different departments, a department chairman, and ultimately a dean. In his professional life, he was director of one of the world's foremost film archives at UCLA, and later the director of the AFI Film School. Later on, he was a film critic, National Public Radio. And above all, he was an activist, always, and an intellectual in the many, many political and cultural spheres that he lived in so radically changed people's lives. He taught not the history of film, but film and history. He taught historical memory. You would never think of Disney, horror films, westerns, historical drama, John Landis again after listening to Robert talk about these films. The works transformed into interpretations that were frankly mind-blowing, and I don't have the time to go through some of them, but let me tell you, it's my biggest regret about Robert's life that a number of these aren't published, because they're really, frankly, mind-blowing. And perhaps most remarkably, he himself admitted he never attained the degree or the training that normally would have been a traditional path to these career posts. And indeed, he never conformed in any sense to the norms and practices of the many worlds he was part of. As much as he impressed those individuals and institutions of which he became part of, he was never really of those places. In fact, he was chair of an academy department without having completed his PhD. His dissertation on French minor, disrupted by the 1968 political upheavals, and something he never finished, despite a great deal of institutional pressure to do so. He was never a traditional academic. He was never a traditional administrator, and he was never a traditional archivist or critic. For me personally, he was my mentor, as we've heard talk, my friend, my boss, and my guide throughout my life. He opened doors for me into academia. He changed me intellectually and introduced me to a universe of knowledge and learning that made me who I am. As David said, gave me the tools. He helped me get into film school. I was at Penn. And then into film programming at the UCLA Film Archives, which led to my long career in programming at the Sundance Film Festival and the Universe of Independent Film and International Film. He was a brilliant teacher who I had the fortune to interact with. And his career, he often said, was changed by fate. He never knew what his career path was going to be. And he would tell me again and again, he had no idea where he was going next, which is one of the reasons why his career was so multifaceted and complicated. Did you know that he was the valedictorian of his class at Rutgers? He grew up in an anarchist colony in New Jersey. He is invited to come teach at UCLA by the students in the department, and Deborah's given us the details. And the creation of a film history class that he taught with Stewart at Penn. And he took over the archive, and I won't go through the really detailed history, almost by accident. He was literally in the right place at the right time. And as remarkable was his career, he was never satisfied. He was constantly working on outside projects. Talk to Chris about the boxes and boxes and boxes in his house. Host of innumerable projects, fueled by his talents as a host. He's a great wine cellar that he had. A mixture of specially invited people leading to the memories at that dinner table that so many of us who were really fortunate had some experience with. He had an intellectual life that was a product of the times we lived in and the battles we went to war with as an activist. And he loved his interactions with artists, with thinkers, and students, both inside and outside the classroom. And of course, his special friendships and companionships with Mary Jane, with Chris, David, Leslie. His legacy is his impact on people who were privileged to have known him, to have shared his lives with him, to share their lives with him, and to have been fortunate enough to be his friends. He once told me he was sometimes criticized because he was interested in everything. Indeed, it was his gift to the world. Thank you very much. Enjoy Kiss Me Deadly.
Those boxes are at the Film and Television Archive at the Packard Humanities Institute, STOA, and Eddie Richmond is going through them right now, and we found a few tapes of lectures and digitized a few, including one about Kiss Me Deadly. So tonight we screen one of Bob's favorite films, Robert Aldrich's Kiss Me Deadly. Taught frequently by Bob, it was only fitting to show a film that grapples with the prospect of the unknown. We are in unsettling times, but I think of Bob's life carved by curiosity, hope, wonder, and activism. It is what makes the archive, and we remember him every day. Often I think to myself, what would Bob do? And I don't know, but he was so enigmatic and also so sharp. But we are guided by his incredible vision for what would become a world-class archive. So thank you to Bob. We're joined by filmmaker Alexander Payne, two-time Academy Award winner, director, writer, and one of the most celebrated filmmakers who studied at the School of Theater, Film, and Television. To introduce tonight's film, please join me in welcoming filmmaker Alexander Payne.
Good evening. It's a real privilege to be in this room with all of you tonight. And as always, when asked to present a movie from my film nerd colleagues, I ask forgiveness if my remarks are too basic. And from civilians, I ask forgiveness if my remarks are too arcane. Kiss Me Deadly is one of cinema's most startling films, the kind you always remember the first time you saw it. In my case, it was at UCLA in the late 1980s, in the big theater up at Melnitz, amid a Robert Aldrich retrospective. They made a big deal out of Kiss Me Deadly, and old Mike Luciano, editor of Kiss Me Deadly and a dozen other Aldrich films, showed up to speak about it. We know it, of course, as one of the pinnacles of American film noir, and a salient example of 50s Cold War nuclear bomb paranoia. It precedes Dr. Strangelove by 9 years. But what struck me that night nearly 40 years ago, and will strike us again tonight, repeat and first-time viewers alike, is its modernity, its swagger, its subversiveness, its cynicism, its brutality. Despite very much embodying its own specific era, Kiss Me Deadly is one of the rare movies that will always transcend its time, their time rather. I recall being struck by its remarkable use of Los Angeles. Mickey Spillane's novel had been set in New York, but Aldrich and screenwriter A.I. Bezerides changed it to here. By the way, you hear his name pronounced Bezerides, but I'm preferring the more correct Greek Bezerides. I scribbled notes as I watched it, and I went in search of some of the shooting locations. Of course, all those beautiful old houses on Bunker Hill were long gone. But Mike Hammer was a local, a Westwood guy, and his apartment building still stands just a few blocks east of here. I mean, how often have we seen any movie shot on the Wilshire corridor? You'll see a great driving shot on Wilshire 2 just down the street. And Aldrich's decision to shoot driving scenes authentically, not in the studio with rear screen projection, is another element lending the movie modernity and reality. I was struck by its casting. I'd seen Ralph Meeker in The Naked Spur and Paths of Glory, but this is the role he was destined to own for film eternity. For those of you who may not know, Meeker had replaced Marlon Brando in the Roadshow production of A Streetcar Named Desire, and had originated the role in Picnic that William Holden went on to play in the movie. I recognized two actors from Citizen Kane, Paul Stewart and Fortunio Bonanova, And you can never forget seeing Cloris Leachman, so young and so striking. Omaha-born character actor Wesley Addy makes an outstanding sleazy cop, as oily a presence as he was to be 32 years later as the surgeon guilty of murder in Sidney Lumet's The Verdict. Furthermore, it's a rare film of the period that to some degree reflects ethnic Los Angeles, black people, Italian people, and Greeks. Greeks? One of the things that impressed me as a Greek American was its depiction of an auto mechanic named Nick Garkos, played by Nick Dennis, an immigrant from Thessalonica, who coincidentally had also acted in A Streetcar Named Desire, both on Broadway and in the movie, as one of the poker player buddies. And this is as good a transition as any to touch briefly on the life and career of Kiss Me Deadly screenwriter Albert Isaac Bezzarides. I'm sure this film literate crowd already knows quite a bit about director Robert Aldrich, his fancy upper-class Rhode Island background, his formative career as an assistant director working under such mentors as Jean Renoir, William Wellman, Charlie Chaplin, Louis Milestone, and Max Ophuls. And we know about his membership in that loose club of maverick directors that includes Wellman, Huston, Fuller, and Peckinpah. But here's a bit about Bezzarides. Born the only son to a Greek father and Armenian mother from Asia Minor, now Turkey, Bezzarides grew up in Fresno, along with LA, that other nexus of Armenians in America. His mother's last name was Kalajian, and throughout his life, Bezzarides identified actually more as an Armenian than as a Greek, even though he wrote stories about Greek characters, first as a novelist, and then as a screenwriter in the movies Juke Girl, 1942, Thieves' Highway, of course, Jules Dassin's fantastic movie from 1949, Beneath the 12-Mile Reef, 1952, and The Angry Hills, 1959, also directed by Aldrich. His other notable credits include Nicholas Ray's wonderful On Dangerous Ground, 1951, and Wellman's Track of the Cat, 1953. And many of you will, of course, recall his first major screen credit as providing the source material for They Drive by Night, 1940, Raoul Walsh, with Humphrey Bogart, Ida Lupino, and George Raft, which, like Thieves' Highway, was about truckers. Bezzarides himself had worked as a trucker in the 1930s. And his immigrant working-class background in Fresno, where, by the way, he grew up alongside William Saroyan. They were the same age and very close friends, and their families were close. And his own early life experience contributed to a strong leftist social consciousness. As such, we should properly regard his career not so much as that of a hard-boiled screenwriter, but rather as a 20th century writer in the same league as John Fante and Pietro Di Donato, Christ in Concrete, Nelson Algren, and of course his old buddy, Bill Saroyan. When he was hired to write the adaptation of Kiss Me Deadly, he hated Mickey Spillane's source novel, and he changed almost everything. Notably, the contents of the MacGuffin, the big what's it, the package everyone is looking for. Bezzarides said, I read the book and thought it was awful, but I could see what I could do to fix it, so I accepted the assignment. I didn't know anything about mafia or gangsters. In the 50s, there was the Cold War, and what interested me were the nuclear discussions. In the book, there's this thing with lockers, a little cardboard box with dope in it, narcotics, but what was interesting in the 50s were the nuclear forces beginning to accumulate. So I didn't make it dope. I made it a nuclear device. That's what was on people's minds back then, and what do you know? Today it's still on their minds. I finished the script in about a month and gave it to Aldrich, and he never said a word. Next thing I know, he's shooting it. Many years later, when Aldrich was sick and about to die, he called me up on the phone to talk about the picture, why he could direct it so fast, and he told me because it was all there in the script. I was awed by that, touched by him saying that. Since tonight's about Bob, let me relate a bit of what Bob had to say about this movie. And my source is an audio recording. May just talked about having digitized some of his lectures, and she was kind enough to send me one containing a lecture about Kiss Me Deadly. The words Bob used repeatedly to describe the movie were weird and disorienting. It's a weird movie that constantly subverts narrative expectations. From the get-go, from the incredible opening credits that roll top to bottom and backwards, you know something in this movie, and maybe in the world, is not quite right. It's disorienting morally because no one in the movie is any good. There are no reference points. Everyone is just out for him or herself, including and especially the protagonist, Mike Hammer. At UCLA Film School back then, we were taught a lot about what Steve Mammer used to call CVA, close visual analysis, the identification of visual patterns unique to a specific film. And in this film, Bob invited the class to notice, for example, the constant use of X's, including when Mike Hammer's body is lying on a bed when he's been handcuffed and he's spread-eagled. Bob speaks a lot in the lecture about angles and framing, high angles, low angles, Dutch angles, and frames, crammed frames, cluttered frames that frustrate your ability to see clearly the elements that are trying to carry the narrative. He spoke about the, quote, constant, intelligent, and constantly disorienting use of diagonals and stairways that crisscross the frame. He mentions how often we feel as though we are falling off the frame and how some of the characters actually do. And of course, Bob talked about the ingenious way Aldrich engineered a low-budget film wherein the director has to find vivid, cinematic ways to get things done quickly. The most famous example in this movie is that long, fluid take that starts on a punching bag, moves to bring Mike Hammer up the stairs into a boxing ring, and where he both has a couple of pages of dialogue with Juan Hernandez and even has time to go make a phone call, all in one take. A lot of the low-budget visual brilliance is in what you don't see. Nothing is more horrifying than hearing a woman scream and moments later seeing only a pair of pliers. And note a shot early on when Ralph Meeker and Wesley Addy are walking down a corridor and get on an elevator. Do you actually see the elevator? I'm very grateful to May for inviting me to be here tonight and to be with Bob again. His brilliance, his warmth, his wit, his great voice. So let's watch the movie. And if you first-timers find the rhythms of the story a little offbeat, even slow, just stay with it. Stay with the fantastic atmosphere. And I bet that, like me years ago, you'll always remember tonight.